This next area, this part three, I want to talk about some different labor unions in the late 19th century. Knights of Labor, National Labor Union, American Federation of Labor. Kind of the big three I want to visit about. The Knights of Labor is one of the more important mass labor unions in the United States in the mid 1880s. They aimed to unite a wide range of producers into one national movement rather than just a single craft like bakers or garment cutters. The Knights of Labor began in Philadelphia in 1869 among skilled workers such as garment cutters, like I mentioned a minute ago. What's interesting is initially they operated as a fraternal society, a secret fraternal society that was meant to protect members from employer retaliation and blacklisting. You can't let people know, you can't let your employer know that you're part of a labor movement or a labor union. So the Knights of Labor initially began as a secret fraternal organization. One of its more famous slogans during its life, an injury to one is the concern of all. And so this talks about the communal, fraternal nature of the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor did more than just, negotiate wages and hours. Kind of a little bit on that kind of utopian side. They promoted a moral and civic vision of labor. Often described as producerist. What is producerist? It's a fancy word meaning society should reward productive work, restrain monopolies, speculation, and political corruption that, in the view of these labor unions, distorted fair competition. So, in other words, your producerist is your pro-producer, your pro-worker. Their agenda mixed workplace demands with reform politics, like the 8-hour workday, restriction of child labor, and security for working class families. Another feature of the Knights of Labor was their support for what's called a cooperative commonwealth. Cooperative commonwealth. And what this meant was it encouraged worker-owned producer cooperatives. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, some Knights of Labor called for public control of railroads, nationalization of railroads, which, we would know as, Marxism. Compared to most 19th century unions, the Knights tried to organize both skilled and unskilled workers, and so that was a debate in the late 19th century as unions were forming. Is like, who can join this labor union, and generally skilled laborers didn't want to be with unskilled laborers. Part of that immigration pattern, why labor unions didn't do so well. And so they tried to, the Knights of Labor tried to bring those sets together with skilled and unskilled labor. They did set boundaries, though. They looked at, with this producerist ideal, who produces. And so, garment cutters, factory workers, who does not produce. From the Knights of Labor point of view, non-producers were people like bankers, lawyers, liquor dealers, and professional gamblers. And so you can kind of see that's how they split it. They looked at who was productive to the economy, who produced, and who did not. An interest in early 21st century America, we want to know, how did they... eventually, women were allowed to join the Knights of Labor, and black workers joined in some numbers, although often segregated. And so, from a 21st century point of view, they were, quote-unquote, somewhat progressive in that eventually In the 1880s, they allowed women and then African American or black workers, generally excluded from most unions, if not all. The Knights of Labor says, you can come in, we'll have you in. They're often segregated, though. The Knights of Labor, though, kind of the balance or the mix of it. The Knights of Labor were supporters of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese, the 1880s, what does American society say about the Chinese? They're not assimilatable. They interfere with workers getting jobs, and so they have to be excluded. So you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? The Knights of Labor generally supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Knights were built as a federated order. What that means is there's a national general assembly that set policy. Then you had district assemblies and then local. And so it wasn't just one labor union to everyone. It was like you had different parts to it. When did the Knights of Labor really get going? The mid to late 1880s. As railroad expansion is really taking off. You see the Knights of Labor membership increasing dramatically. One of their bigger events in 1885, the Knights of Labor struck against railroad magnate Jay Gould. And so that really helped. Their growth from about 110,000 in 1885 to around 720,000 by 1886. So that was a massive percentage. In 1886, the Knights became central to the Great Southwest Railroad strike, involving about 200,000 workers from across multiple states. And so that's pretty influential, right? At their heights, the Knights were generally a national movement. They had assemblies spread through thousands of towns. Membership estimates range from hundreds of thousands to, possibly a little bit exaggerated, but I've seen sources approaching 1 million by the late 1880s. Okay, and this got them big. This got them big as they started they participating in politics, and that's kind of the thing. You're like. How did parties develop how did labor parties or working parties, class parties develop in Europe? Same thing. You organize, you have successful strikes, you negotiate, then you get big enough that you just start dealing in politics. And the Knights of Labor actually started to do that by the late 1880s. Why did they collapse? By the 1890s, they had pretty much collapsed. Number one, public backlash and reputation damage because of the Haymarket Square bombing, which we'll talk about later. Overextension and weak central control. The Knights grew faster than their institution could manage, and you just saw that from 100,000 to 700,000 in a year. So it's making it harder to enforce strategy, finance long strikes, and prevent local conflicts from becoming national liabilities. You had strategic and constituency tensions. The problem is a one big tent organization contains competing priorities: skilled versus unskilled, political reform, utopian reform that we talked about earlier, or workplace bargaining. I just need better hours or a pay raise, right? And so it goes back to that, what we said earlier, that this idea of this immigration movement, immigration patterns, being able to pit unions within unions, compete them against each other. The American Labor Union by the 1890s was becoming the main large labor union in the United States, and so the Knights kind of weaken as more and more workers and unions go to the AFL model. And so that is the Knights of Labor. Next, we have The National Labor Union. The National Labor Union is an interesting organization. Comes the rival of the Knights of Labor. The National Labor Union emerged in the immediate post-Civil War surge of organizing and reform agitation. It was founded at a National Labor Congress in 1866. You had delegates from multiple trades and states meeting to coordinate labor's demands on a national scale, appointing committees that each one focused on different things like pay raise or an 8-hour workday. Institutionally, the National Labor Union functioned less like a single bargaining union and more like a federation or coalition. It tried to bring together city labor councils, national labor unions, sympathetic reform groups into a national body that could press for legislation and shape public policy. In the early phases of the NLU concentrated heavily on shorter work hours, especially a federal 8-hour workday law. Over time, its agenda broadened into what labor observers describe as reform unionism. The NLU increasingly stressed producers' cooperatives and public policy solutions, such as currency credit and other reforms. This evolution culminated in a decisive and divisive attempt to get into third-party politics. In 1872, the NLU supported the National Labor Reform Party, and they nominated U.S. Supreme Court Justice David Davis as kind of a president of this new political party, and that kind of parallels this development in Europe. You have these worker organizations. They develop, they organize, they negotiate, they win at the negotiating table, at the strike table, and then they get into politics, right? So here in 1872, you have the National Labor Reform Party. It wasn't viewed as a positive thing by many. By the early 1870s, economic instability and the NLU's internal strategic tension versus reform politics, the National Labor Reform Party, and just trade unionism, meaning negotiate for an 8-hour workday, contributed to its collapse. And the NLU effectively ended by the mid-late 1870s. Some of their policy stances as a labor union and a political party, the 8-hour workday, legislative strategy, and industrial peace, meaning a major NLU instinct was to work through the law and public policies rather than more radical labor unions like we talked about before with the IWW. They argued for producer cooperatives, worker-run cooperative production. They argued for currency and credit reform, for example, greenbacks. Greenbacks are what you and I have in our wallet, paper money. They supported that to expand paper currency. More people would have access to money and easier credit. And they had a longer-term federal labor, information labor department vision, meaning they advocated for a federal labor board, Federal Bureau of Labor, was eventually created in 1884, long after the demise of the NLU, but it's that germ of that idea that, the federal government is so on the side of, business, getting the government involved in the labor side too, organizing it. Next, I want to talk about the American Federation of Labor, and Samuel Gompers, one of the One of the more famous 19th century individuals, probably, Samuel Gompers, born in 1850, died in 1924, as you can kind of see the area he lived in. He came out of the skilled trades world, born in London to a Jewish family. Eventually, his family came to New York during the Civil War. His main career was as a cigar maker. For some reason, I had to pronounce cigar in a weird, crazy way, but cigar maker and union officer before then entering into unionism. His real power base was with the craft union. He organized the Cigar Makers Union, and that eventually developed into the American Federation of Labor, founded in December of 1886. First named the Federation of Craft Unions. And so that's kind of the difference between that and the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor sought this one big organization, all workers kind of a thing. And so the American Federation of Labor is kind of narrowing where craft unions, plumbers, electricians, right? Gompers was the AFL Central Administrator and Public Face for nearly 4 decades. He was first president of the AFL between 1886 and 1894. He lost for a year, got kicked out for a year, he came back 1895 to 1924 when he died. And so it was ran not as a single union, but as a federation, an autonomous national, international craft union. So each group, bakers and railroad workers and miners, you'd have your own labor union, like miners in Nevada, the United Federation of Miners. You have your own craft union underneath the AFL. And it's this model sought to reduce chaos by emphasizing national union. Gompers in the AFL are most associated with what historians and contemporaries call pure and simple unionism. In other words, bread and butter policy priorities. In other words, we're not like the utopian unions that want reform politics and all this crazy stuff, or crazy from one point of view. A focus on achievable economic gains. Gompers in the AFL supported volunteerism. Gompers argued unions should rely primarily on economic weapons like collective bargaining, strikes, and boycotts, and maintain independence from utopian reform schemes. You should voluntarism, meaning things should be voluntary. The AFL rejected European-style Labour Party strategy that you saw with the National Labour Union. The National Labour Union tried to get into third-party politics, right, and didn't do so well. Whereas the AFL is, strictly, negotiating, targeted influence, and doesn't get it really into, not a Labour Party. The AFL did fight for the 8-hour workday. They did develop institutional bargaining and employee relations. They got some federal policy gains like the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Adamson Act. The bottom line of this is, under Gompers, the AFL became the dominant U.S. labor federation in the United States by emphasizing durable craft organizations, collective bargaining, disciplined economic pressure, and pragmatic politics. You couldn't accuse Samuel Gompers of being a dangerous foreign radical. You couldn't accuse him of being a terrorist. You couldn't accuse, he wasn't utopian. He wasn't anti-American. He wasn't un-American. Right? And so it did well. It still exists today. It's AFL-CIO today, but it's still around today. So it's an enduring part of American life.